thank you very much, Emma and John Baines, for inviting me to talk about rather a personal subject, my family in China. It doesn't, on the face of it, sound a very interesting subject, but I'm hoping to grip you a bit and tell you about my experiences in China over the last 80 years and my family's experiences in China since about 1870. So this was my family in about 1925, and that is my great-grandfather, my great-uncle, my grandmother, my great-aunt, and you'll meet all these people again later, and then my mother in 1925. My mother passed away sadly last year at the ripe old age of about 95. So I'm going to talk initially about my family because they were very much involved in the history of China from mainly the early 20th century. But my great-great-grandfather here went back and went to China in 1870. My great-grandfather here was born in Shanghai in 1877, I think it was. Then my grandmother here, my maternal grandmother, my mother sitting here in a bronze ding, Chinese bronze ding. And then I turned up in 1940.
She was not,
as a very grumpy looking baby there. So I've had the privilege of traveling around this remarkable country for on many occasions. And these are just a few of in red, the cities I visited. There are more, but I've sort of forgotten them. And the blue is where different members of my family were born. So my great-grandfather, born in 1845, he went there as a young lad in 1870 as an American Presbyterian missionary. My mother's side of the family are all Americans, and they were originally American Presbyterian missionaries. So this is great-grandfather George, who went as a missionary originally to Suzhou and in that area on the coast, and later went to Shanghai and spent 50 years in China as a missionary. And because he had a long beard like this, the Chinese considered him to be a very wise man. A very interesting man in that he set up China's first modern printing presses to print Bibles and prayer books. And he taught at Chinese schools, missionary schools, and this is one of the very early missionary schools here, and pupils, young and older, with, I believe, my great-great-grandfather here. And you can see they've all got the Manchu haircut and with the long pigtails, which you'll see later. And he is the only known missionary to have had a church dedicated to his memory in China. And this church exists in Shanghai. I visited it in year before last, and worshipped in it. He died of influenza in 1923 in Shanghai, and they built this church, which is on 2 levels. I was on the upper level for evening service. The church was absolutely packed as it is every Sunday, for 3 services every Sunday. And this is the young pastor there. She's the pastor, and this says here, the Fitch Memorial Church. And we had lunch together, and I went to her evensong service, which was a very moving experience for me to visit there some 100 years later. It's interesting, just a few factoids for you. As a result of some of the very early pioneering work of my great-grandfather, they've published 50 million Bibles. In 2008, they can print 1 million Bibles a month. And most of you will not realize that the largest Christian population in a country in the world is in China. Today, it's about 60 million people, and it is the fastest growing religion in China with an average annual increase of about 7%. I think that surprises a lot of people. My great-grandfather Robert was born in China in 1922 in Shanghai. He was George's first son, here looking a bit stern in his American passport picture. And he had a fascinating life. And some of his very early converts, this is one family, the old man and the old lady, with I think 9 or 11 children I've counted here. The reason I show this is because they're all dressed in the traditional garb that they would have been dressed in at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And I love this as a family picture of some of the first converts by my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather went on to found a Christian boys' school in Hangchow. What we called Hangchow then is now known as Hangzhou. Some of you may have been to Hangzhou, a very beautiful city. It's called Heaven on Earth by the Chinese. And he founded Zhejiang University there, which started as a boys' school. And you can see here his pupils. This is my great-grandfather here with his early pupils as a boys' boarding school. And you can see the older boys have got the Manchu haircut, and they will all have a long pigtail going down to their waists, never having cut their hair. While there, my great-grandfather built this beautiful, beautiful house called Temple Roofs, and it comprised the sort of the church side at the bottom there, and the family lived in the top there. And my great-grandmother was a very, very keen gardener, apparently a very beautiful garden. And it was in the old Tartar city in a lane called Happiness Lane. And this is the family in the garden there, my grandmother here and my great-grandfather and great-grandmother. And then some years later, my mother and my great-grandfather, who actually baptized me in early 1941 before we emigrated to America for the duration of the war. My great-grandfather, Robert, published a lot of books and articles, and this is one of them here called Hangzhou Itineraries, which is a very famous book on Hangzhou, and now sells for anywhere between $300 and $500 online, if you can find a copy. And he was a very keen photographer and went around, as you'll hear later, went around China photographing a lot. And in the book, he had a series of maps for planned walks around the Hangzhou area. And this particular one is from Hangzhou up to where the university that he later built was, and Six Harmony Pagoda, you'll see in a minute. The Christian College became Hangzhou University, and this is the early days of the university that he finished building. He supervised the construction of this university campus, which I visited several times, and you'll see in a minute. And he had this house up on the top of the hill there. This is the main admin building there, the dormitories and things down here, and the staff and his house right at the top there. And this is the Changtan River, which runs along, very famous river there, the Xinjiang River. That's the pagoda I mentioned earlier, and this was pictured by my grandfather of the Xinjiang River, which is famous because it has this huge tidal bore that comes all the way up it on every full moon. In the late 20s, there were late 1920s, severe famines, as often happened in China, and he was asked to take over as international famine relief there. He arranged the funds, got the food and the transport, and organized all that. The school that started off as a boarding school became a college, then it became a university, and is now part of Zhejiang campus. Zhejiang is the biggest, I think the biggest or near biggest university in China now. And his old university is part of the whole Zhejiang complex. And I'll just show you a few pictures of this. This is originally from 1912, the original headquarters, as it were, house, and some of the classrooms. Laboratories were here as well. And in 1912, for the opening of the college, Sun Yat-sen, who was, some of you who know the history of China will know that Dr. Sun Yat-sen was the founder of the Republic of China. And when the Emperor Pu Yi was deposed in, I think it was 1908, and he came for the opening of the college, and my grandfather's sitting there. He, having built all of this complex, supervised the building. A few pictures of the old alumni from the college, and I show these to show you the traditional dress. This is probably around about just after the turn of the century, the 20th century, and their traditional Chinese, these would be their best Chinese robes and their hats. And my great-grandfather here with some of his students and staff here, some in Western dress, some in Chinese traditional robes, probably around about 1908, 1910. Again, the staff here of the university and my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather there. And this was at that time called the Hangchow Presbyterian College. When I visited this university about 5 times now, every time I go to Hangzhou. And when I went last time, I went and introduced myself at the front desk, and they said, oh, the president will want to know about you. So he got the president, it's now a law school. This is the president of the college. He said, I have a picture of your great-grandfather, and there was one in the library, and he got the picture out for me and showed it. And this is the way the campus looks now, and the way it looked, you saw the way it looked. It's now a very beautiful campus, as it is now. And the church, these are pictures by myself that I've taken. This is the church in which he would have preached every Sunday and worshipped, and the house in which they lived right at the top of the hill. The Japanese, as you may know from the history, invaded China in the mid-1930s and invaded Hangzhou in 1937. College was evacuated and moved all over China, trying to avoid the Japanese, and the campus was almost destroyed. Robert Fitch was placed under house arrest by the Japanese. He refused to abandon China at the time. He was tortured and paraded in the streets with the dunces' hats on, as they did, and much humiliated by the Japanese. And Temple Roofs was taken over by as Japanese military headquarters. And at the end of the war, he was found by the US military much emaciated, and they thought he would die. He had almost starved. Recently, when I went back, I found the seminary. You'd be surprised the number. This is the entrance seminary where they, as it were, breed future priests for China. And whilst there, I met this wonderful elderly gentleman with 2 young priests and tutors. And he said, oh, I remember your great-grandfather. He very famous. Oh, I said, that's nice. He very rich, very rich. I said, no, missionaries aren't rich. He said, oh, must be very rich. And I said, why would you? Oh, he had the first car in Hangzhou. So he became famous because he had the first ever car. He also had the first outboard motor on a little boat on the lake, famous Hangzhou Lake, and I think the first motorbike. So he was quite a go-getter. And going into the library, I could see some of the books that he'd written. It was quite a moving experience. During the summers in Hangzhou are very, very hot, and the missionary families would go up to this beautiful Moganshan, this beautiful mountain retreat. I took these pictures when I visited about 5 or 6 years ago, and the bamboo forest, and you can walk around, and it really is stunning scenery and much, much cooler. And the church in which he would have preached on Sundays, and the sort of villa, not this one necessarily, the sort of villa they would have lived in the summer. As I said, Robert Fitch was a very, quite well-known and very enthusiastic photographer, as I am myself. And he and a millionaire chap from America both decided to go through China up to the borders of Tibet on a major photographic exhibition. I'm going to show you just a few of some of the pictures that they took together, because this is an effort to try and show you the old China, and then we'll go on some of my travels to show you the new China. This is the Yangtze River going up through the 3 gorges and the little sampans here. And people would live, some of them, the bigger ones, they'd spend their whole life living on these sampans. And these ones would be like ferries crossing the river and taking people up and down the rivers. This is going through the three gorges, which I had the pleasure of doing, and I'll show you later, about 8-9 years ago. And the village is perched up because the river would sometimes rise right up to this sort of level. The rise was always very high. And of course now, with the Gorges Dam, which I'll show you, the level is somewhere up here. And temples, these have all been buried, not buried, but flooded now by the waters. Now that the Three Gorges Dam has filled the Yangtze River up considerably. They went all the way up the Yangtze River to as far as the Tibetan border. This is Tibet on this side and China on this side. And they went on through. And I'm going to show you just a few of the hundreds of pictures I've got. My cousin, American cousin, lives in Washington. Roy Sewell inherited all of his pictures, and I spent a lovely couple of days with him going through them, and he's putting them online now. And these are historically, I believe, very important. And he took a lot of people working, people's portraits and so on. And I'm just going to go through these reasonably quickly, of portraits of just individuals they came across. And you can see the fascinating things, the wonderful, I believe, wonderful faces on some of them. Obviously very poor, most of them, workers somewhere in a store here by the looks of it. What a beautiful, wonderful face. And a little kid there having his supper, his little rice bowl and his chopsticks there. This is one of my favorites. There's a basket weaver here, but this face, I think, is just amazing to me. And I think these are taken in an old-fashioned camera, and I think are excellent. This is at a cafe smoking. I'm not sure whether this looks like an opium pipe to me, but I'm not sure that it is. And this chap most certainly was an opium smoker because of his emaciation. But look at that face. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful face. So Robert Fitch was then asked also by the American minister in Shanghai, the ambassador, to photograph and study the lives of the boat people in China. And he did a project on that. And he published several articles in National Geographic magazine, which I've been fortunate enough to find online, original copies. And this is the one he did, Life Afloat in China, in 1927. And just a few of the pictures he took, very atmospheric picture there. This is going up the Yangtze River there. I'll show you it in more modern times. Junks going up the river. I seem to have got a blue line come there. I don't know where that's come from. And these are junks. Some of them would go up and down. These would ply up and down the Yangtze and be poled up the Yangtze through the rapids. And people would live on these, whole families would live on these. And this is the Bund in Shanghai. Some of you will have walked along there. Certainly the groups of gynecologists, the gaggles of gynecologists that I've taken around China have walked along here several times, the old banks and so on. I remember walking along there at the age of 6 after we returned after the war with my parents. These junks would carry huge cargoes like this. And these were the taxis going across the river and up and down the river. Whole families would have spent their whole life living on these junks. And my great-grandfather, he spent weeks and weeks traveling up and down the Yangtze and the other rivers of China, living on board with these families. Must have been the most amazing experience, I believe. And these, again, the junks built, being poled here with huge amounts of cargo on board. This is in Hong Kong. When I lived in Hong Kong, we could look down over Aberdeen Harbour, which some of you may have visited. Unfortunately, not many junks there nowadays. This, a rather smart home, I believe this might have been a brothel, but I'm not sure because it's so smart, but a very, very beautifully decorated junk. Great-grandfather also visited many of the temples in China, because the religion was allowed at that time. It was only under Mao that it went down, and now it's become fashionable again. And he befriended many of the abbots of the different temples, and they exchanged friendships and ideas and philosophies. And he used to sit, because he was fluent, as were all my family in Chinese. He would sit and talk about philosophy and things to the abbots of these temples. And I visited this Ling Yin Temple, as you'll see in a minute. These lovely shots that he took in some of the different temples. I think this is one of the abbots of I think this was the abbot of Linying and another abbot there. And I visited this not so long ago, well, 2 or 3 times, and taken much the same pictures as he took 100 years before. For me, very excitingly too, great-grandfather visited Putu Island, which is an island, it's quite a small island, but it's got dozens of monasteries on it. And he visited and became friends with many of the abbots on Putu Island. And he wrote a book on it, Putu Itineraries, which again fetches $300 to $500 online now, if you can find it. I've not been able to afford or find one now. But he also published in National Geographic magazine, which I have, on Putu Island, and took these pictures as a photographer, a keen photographer myself. I think the composition of some of these is quite remarkable. And I've got a picture myself of the same temples taken almost exactly 100 years ago when I visited last year, the year before last, 2019, I visited here. And the same pictures are in his book and in his geographic articles. One of the monks beating a gong. This is a wooden thing, which is a gong. And another gong here, a bronze fish, which I photographed myself, although it's a slightly different fish. But the call to prayer is banged on this bronze gong. And another one, a different temple, with a ding, which they call to prayer. A few pictures of people at work in China. I'm trying to show you old China as it was in the early 20th century, and then as I've seen it in the last 30 or 40 years. People at work in China. This is the local taxi service in about probably 1905, 1910, and these would have been the taxi drivers. As you'll see here, this is the taxi service here, and this is the main road here out in the countryside, with these poor chaps. Really, really hard work, that is. This is a water mill. The water would have been brought up, and these chaps would spend all day long, virtually, pedaling on this water mill to drive it, to bring up the water for the paddy fields. This chap weaving baskets, the young lad, and living in these straw huts in the countryside. And you don't see these now if you go in the countryside, which you'll see an old farmhouse later on. Shop front. And one of my favorite pictures of this old boy having some lunch here on the side of the road. As some of you will know, anyone interested in China, I'm obviously a Sinophile myself, but the West really carved China up really badly. Britain, Germany, France, Italy, France, and the Japanese. Between us, we had 2 wars in the 19th centuries. Some will know the Opium War, 2 Opium Wars, which we did terrible things to China, unfortunately. I've got about 100 books on the history of China, so I'm always fascinated by the history. My grandparents lived through the Boxer Rebellion, which I don't have time to talk about, but during that rebellion, 270 missionaries, Western missionaries, were killed, and 18,000 Chinese Christians were massacred during that Boxer Rebellion. And this, I've got a diary from my grandmother when she was living in Hangzhou, which is now part of Wuhan, which I visited. I'll tell you about in a minute. And she says here, this is Hangzhou in 1927, which is a bit later. The country is full of beheaded men. Yesterday, Marshal Wu beheaded 9 men in the printing office, and she would see, looking out of her apartment onto the Bund in Hangzhou, she would see dead bodies lying around. And this is, I thought, very prescient. Many of the officers in the Red Army are Russians. As we know, the Russians organized the Reds. Soviet Russia is slowly spreading her tentacles throughout the East, and nobody seems able to do a thing. And I thought that was an interesting quote from her diary. Robert, my great-grandfather's brother, my great-uncle George, was another fascinating man. His time in China, he wrote this interesting book. That was the book about Uncle George. That was the book about, with all my great-grandfather's pictures in, and the National Geographics. And great-uncle George wrote a fascinating book on his 80 years in China, as a missionary in China. He was great-grandfather's younger son. We happen to be related to a past president of the United States, just thought I'd throw that in. And all of that side of the family were missionaries for 3 generations. He got heavily involved in the YMCA, which was big in China, and it was run by Christian missionaries mainly. And here you have Sun Yat-sen again, and the prime minister of China at the time, Tong, in about 1911, opening the new YMCA. When I was taking a group of, so he was a missionary in China. He became friends with Dong Xiaoyi and Sun Yat-sen. He got to meet them, and General Chiang Kai-shek. This is his great-uncle George meeting Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Those of you know the history know that Dr. Sun Yat-sen died fairly young, soon after taking over as president of China. And Generalissimo, as he termed himself later, Chiang Kai-shek became president. And then he evacuated in 1949 and went to, became president in Taiwan. So George had a very interesting time, and he built a new building, a new YMCA, which I found at the top of Nanjing Road in Shanghai. Those of you who've been to Shanghai will have walked up Nanjing Road, where the old race course used to be. And he supervised the building of this beautiful Art Deco building in about 1926. I thought the decorative features on there are lovely. So he moved to Nanking in 1936, working in YMCA. The Japanese invaded Nanking, and some of you who know the history will know that the Japanese massacred tens of thousands of Chinese, many citizens, and it's commemorated in a memorial hall here, which shows a lot of the pictures from that terrible time, December 37 to January 38. Tens of thousands of Chinese were massacred. And these Westerners, this is great uncle George here, set up something called the Nanking Safety Zone. And it was a big area of Nanking. And they were allowed to take civilians into this area. And John Raby, who was a German of Siemens in Nanjing, he became chairman. He was a Nazi, but he was chosen because the Japanese and the Nazis were in cahoots. And this is great uncle George here, who became director of the ICNZ, and he also became mayor of Nanking. So my great uncle at one time was mayor of Nanking. I thought it was rather unusual honor. And this refugee area took in tens of thousands of, as many as they could, refugees, mainly women and children. If soldiers went in there, they were extracted by the Japanese and killed. And if you're interested in the history of the Nanking Massacre, there are 3 or 4 horrendous films about it, several books about it, all of which I've got, and it makes pretty horrific reading. George Fitch succeeded in smuggling some very revealing films out of Nanjing in the lining of his greatcoat. If he'd been caught, he would have been executed. And he took them to America. As an American, he took them to America and traveled throughout America, telling people what was going on in China, because nobody in America or Britain or Europe knew that these massacres were occurring in China. And he became very well known in China for this. And after the war, he received a number of honors and decorations in China. And he was also asked to do relief work for soldiers in the Sino-Japanese war further up country, and headed up the emergency services. And as part of that, he traveled from Chongqing, which was then the capital of China, which is right up halfway up the Yangtze River, far west. He traveled up to Yunnan on the top of one of these lorries with all of these troops, and became good friends with Zhou Enlai. Now, again, if you know the history, you will know that Zhou Enlai was prime minister with Mao Zedong, and was a very great man. He was one of the great men of China, and a very cultured and educated man. And fortunately, during the Cultural Revolution, he saved a lot of the artifacts that were being destroyed by the Red Guards. And there's a whole lot of history there, which is absolutely fascinating. It's all happened in some of us older people's lifetimes. In Yunnan, Mao Zedong set up headquarters there in the caves in Yunnan. Yunnan is built of this, is built on this loess, they call it loess, which is a type of stone, sandy stone. And they built the caves, which were hotels. And Uncle George here, this is Zhou Enlai, who I hugely admire, and Wang Ming here too, who is also one of the key people. When I show these pictures in China, they go, wow, you know, your grandfather, great uncle knew these people. And then when I show this picture, when he met Mao Zedong, who visited him in his hotel cave, they go, wow, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, wow. So there's Uncle George meeting Mao Zedong and another colleague there. So he was very much involved in that part of the history of China, which is fascinating, and in his detail in his book. Great Aunt Janet, who was my maternal grandmother's sister, she became quite well known in China, and she was a teacher at Chiang College of Agriculture and a very accomplished artist. And she wrote this book, Foreign Devil. We were called either Foreign Devils, Guilo, or Darbidze. Darbidze means long nose, because we all had long noses compared to the Chinese. And we were called Foreign Devils. And she became very friendly with Chiang Kai-shek when he was president. Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Mei-ling Sung. She was one of three sisters, a very famous. I visited her house in Shanghai, in Beijing recently. Mei-ling Sung became good friends with my great aunt. And Mei-ling Sung wrote a lot of Chinese fairy tales and folklore stories. And my great aunt illustrated all of her books, which with, I think, quite stunning pictures to illustrate these fairy tale books. And George and the cousin I visited in America, who keeps all this stuff and great-grandfather's pictures, has all this original artwork, and it was a privilege to be able to see it. So my father, Dudley, visited China for the first time as a young bachelor at the age of 19 in 1931. So he would have overlapped, of course, with the missionary family. This is his passport, which he had to carry all around China, which I have a copy on my wall. And apparently this just allows him to travel in certain parts of China. What I find quite amusing is that his tutor in London University before he went to China in Chinese, the School of Oriental Studies, was Reginald Johnson, who, if you've ever seen the film The Last Emperor, or read the books by Pu Yi, this is Pu Yi, The Last Emperor of China. I've read 3 or 4 of his biographies. When Reginald Johnson left China, he became a tutor at School of Oriental Studies in London University, and he taught my father Chinese. So Pu Yi's tutor was my father's tutor. I just think it's a nice story. So father and mother, this is my mother here, she got married at the tender age of 18, which was quite normal and common in those days, and attractive young ladies were few and far between European ladies were few and far between in China at that time. And I found here the church in which they were married in Hangzhou. They were married there in 1939 in Hangzhou, which is now part of Wuhan. And I visited there after my Yangtze trip. So my father traveled extensively in old China. He traveled in these Peking carts, very modern transport at the time. This is him here in his jodhpurs and boots, freezing cold weather up in the north of China. And his retinue here, who would drive the carts and look after him. He would have his own boy and cook and everything else traveling with him. And here you can see the carts going on the main roads here in China in the early 30s. Here he is in full winter garb here with his boy and all the baggage and stuff. And he would travel through the interior of China. He worked for a company called British American Tobacco Company, BAT, famous. They sold cigarettes to the Chinese, a huge, huge market. The Chinese are and were and are strong smokers. My father's travels continued in old China. He would travel to the interior. They'd never seen a white man before. And he would visit these merchants here who lived in these beautiful, beautiful old houses, all then still in the 30s in these traditional robes with these bobble hats. And most of the wealthy ones had these lovely houses and the outer compound, the inner compounds and so on, very similar to the house we lived in Peking. When we lived in Peking, we lived in the Hutongs, which some of you may have heard of, these tiny with narrow alleyways and the houses all crowded in. So many of these now, unfortunately, are being destroyed and new skyscrapers are built in their place. But this is a sort of general layout and similar to the house we lived in. You go in here, you can't go straight in because the devil might come in, so the devil can't turn corners, so you have to take an angle. And this is the entrance to our front door, taken in 1940, and the outer courtyard, the front gate would have been over here, and you come through here, and you'll see that again in a minute. And this is the sitting room, dining room area here, the outer courtyard, and the inner courtyard where our bedrooms and things were. And I remember this as a child up till the age of about 9, living here, my mother here, with the classic moon gate and our Chinese pictures. And this, I visited the house 3 years ago, and this is what it looks like now, a bit more dilapidated than it was. But this lovely, lovely elderly gentleman here, who was a well-known author, a real academic, a really nice man, and his wife, who I think you'll meet, yes, his wife here was a doctor, and he gave me 2 or 3 of his books. He published numerous books, and he gave me several of his books. And you saw the moon gate earlier on. This is the moon gate here, moon door, but it's all been partitioned off now. So the large, spacious area we had before is all gone. So I left China in 49. We left in Hong Kong for 2 years and then came home to boarding school. Didn't see my family for 3 years and then for 2 years because they didn't get home leaves very often. But I returned to China in 1989, first of many visits. I've been granted 4 honorary professorships, visiting professorships during that time, visited all these different places to lecture and here to conferences. And interestingly, I passed through Tiananmen Square here just at the time in 1989 when this was happening, and we were driving past on the way to the airport. I said, "Oh, come to the taxi driver, can we stop?" He said, no, very, very bad, very bad. So I said, "Why? These are all young students. They look happy and everything, and you can see Liberty there, Statue of Liberty." He said, no, very bad, very bad. And I got home the next morning and found the headlines was this massacre had happened. I visited the hospital in which I was born. I was born up here somewhere, probably. My birth certificates, duplicate. And I was born in Peking, not in Beijing, Peking as it was known there. Before that, it was Peiping. And this is my birth certificate, which was birth records, baby Brinsden, a term living male. But the important thing here was that I was said to be essentially normal. And it's the first and last time in my life I've been called essentially normal. So I visited the IVF unit because I'm an IVF specialist, or was, as you heard. I visited IVF units and lectured and spoken to colleagues there. I received an honorary professorship from the hospital, university hospital in which I was born, by this lovely lady you'll meet again later on, and the usual banquet afterwards. So a little bit about old China, the Shanghai that my parents knew. In those days, the river was full of sampans and junks, and this is the Bund here, which some of you may have walked along. The Bund again, as it was in the 30s there. Now this is all changed now. This is Suzhou Bridge and the hotel in which I've stayed a few times there. So that's Shanghai of the 10s and 20s and 30s. And this is Suzhou Bridge and the hotel I've stayed in a couple of times as it is now. And this is Shanghai of now. In those days, 30s, there was nothing where this is now. This is the Pearl Tower. I've been up to the top of there, and you get the most amazing views from up there. And all of this and most of Shanghai has sprung up in the last few years. So Peking, the old Peking, which my parents knew and my grandparents knew, and I knew a little bit in the 40s when I came back after the war. This is the old Peking going up to the Forbidden City up there, the entrance to the Forbidden City. A road again leading up the Forbidden City. And the reason I show this is because they've got rickshaws here, the rickshaw camp. I used to be taken to school in one of these rickshaws. And even then they had the old Manchu haircut with the long pigtails there. This is, as it is, one of my trips to the Forbidden City. Forbidden City is absolutely huge, absolutely amazing. It's a must-see. I took this from the top of the Coal Hill, what's called Coal Hill, 2 years ago when I was there. An amazing place. And the Summer Palace is truly amazing itself. And we used to go there on a Sunday afternoon. This is my father here before I turned up. And the Dowager Empress's marble boat, very famous marble boat as it was in the 30s. And as I took this, as it is nowadays, I took this about 3 or 4 years ago. When I first went back in 1989, everyone traveled by bicycle, just bicycles. There were hardly any cars as there are now. Nowadays, and there were no high-rise buildings. Peking was not much more than 2 or 3 or 4 stories tall. Unfortunately, it's been invaded. When I went back in 89, I went to the Peking Duck restaurant, and the first thing I saw next to it was Kentucky Fried Chicken. And this was the only one in China at the time. I couldn't believe it, how things have changed. And the Bird's Nest Stadium, as it is now. Xian is an amazing place, and these wonderful towers. This is one of the bell towers, but it's been desecrated by things like that. The Terracotta Warriors, truly remarkable. And I've visited them, I think, 5 times now. And each time you see something new. And I've met this old boy who's the farmer who actually found the first warrior under his field, and a fascinating fellow, interesting life. Transportation in today's China is quite interesting. You wander around the back streets of China. I find wandering around on my own is particularly educational. You can poke your nose in everywhere. And this is sort of still going on nowadays in modern China. As opposed to this, there are bullet trains all over the place, proliferating all over the place. I was traveling at 300 kilometers an hour between there and Suzhou. 16,000 miles of high-speed railway track have been built in the last 20 years, I think. And it's going to increase by 8,000 miles further more in the next 5 years. 8,000 more miles in the next 5 years. And we can't build 200 miles worth in 10 or 15 years or 20 years. This is one of the unfortunate consequences. This is probably one of the world's biggest traffic jams. This is after one of the Chinese holidays coming through the toll bridge here. And the traffic in Beijing, the traffic in Shanghai is just appalling. I've been privileged to visit Mao Zedong's birthplace. I've got 3 big, thick biographies on his life. Not a nice man at all. But wherever I go when I'm on my own, I always get surrounded by young students who want to practice their English, which is great fun for me. There's me under Mao Zedong's here, and these young students all want to come and have a chat and practice English and hear about things Western. Here's a couple, this is in Wuhan, some really hip young men, young people. Things have changed hugely, as you can see from the pictures I showed you earlier to what it is like now. This is where Mao Zedong was born. My trip down the Yangtze from Chongqing, which is an amazing city. Going down the river, I'm speeding up a bit because I'm running a bit late. Going down through the 3 gorges here. I don't know if you've all got a blue line going down here. I don't know where that's come from, but I have. This is the 3 Gorges Dam, which most of you will have heard of. It is absolutely amazing. I've got a whole load of pictures about it, but it is amazing. And the consequences of this building, this dam, are very far-reaching. I always like to go out into the far country. I took a taxi out. I was told by him that I could meet this absolutely lovely lady who was a widow in this farmhouse, miles from anywhere. And this was her living room, kitchen, dining room, everything else room. I think she had a bedroom next door, which I didn't invade. And she just had such a beautiful face too. And right next door here, to the door here, was her pigsty, her precious pigs, and where she's standing is where her toilet is. So that would be her toilet, and the pigs share that as well. So that was rural living. And I like people to be aware that that is still, so many people are going into the cities nowadays. These huge skyscrapers are all over the place now. McDonald's you've already seen. And it is a hugely modern, sophisticated society now. You'll have gathered by now that I'm a bit of an enthusiast. I'm quite a Sinophile. I'm proud of the fact that I was born in China, 4th generation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4th generation to be born in China. I'm entitled to a Chinese passport, but they said I'd have to give up my English passport. So I decided I'd hang on to my English passport. I'm proud of the fact and to have had the very emotional experience of worshipping in a full church. There must have been 400 or 500 people there on a Sunday evening in a church dedicated to the memory of my great-great-grandfather. The university that my great-grandfather built, Robert Fitch here, absolutely beautiful campus, and seeing all the young students there and going into the library there and seeing his pictures and his books there, and visiting his house and the church where he used to preach, and visiting, being lucky enough to visit Putu Island, where he visited 100 years previously, and had published, as I said. I had the honor of being invited to by the Women's Federation of China, which is a huge and very prestigious group. But women are very strong in China, to lecture in the Great Hall of the People. This is the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square here. And I gave a talk to the Women's Federation of China, and we had the conference in the Great Hall of the People. I've become very friendly with China's clinic that made China's first test tube baby, because our team, not me personally, our team, Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards, made the world's first test tube baby, and I took over when Patrick died. So our first baby and their first baby we've become friends. And doing clinics out there and learning about the infertile Chinese people's problems, really lovely, and working with your Chinese colleagues and them bringing their problem cases to you. What would you do, Dr. Peter? Was always a very great privilege. I've written a few texts, edited or written a few textbooks in my time, and the English version has been in Chinese. And to go into the clinic and see your textbooks in Chinese in the laboratories and in the clinics is quite, I don't mean to sound big-headed about it,
we
but
don't hear anything anymore.
Yeah. I'm nearly finished. And then finally, to receive an honorary professorship from this lady, 94 or 5 she was then. She was a young intern when I was born there, a young resident on the obstetric wards when I was born there. And she gave me my honorary professorship. And that to me was almost one of the highlights. So it's been a privilege, and I've had the privilege of taking 3 lots of John Baines gaggles of gynecologists out there with me. And that's been a singular privilege as well. Enjoyed every minute of hard work, trying to marshal and keep 10 or 20 gynecologists all in one group, especially in the Forbidden City. And I'm glad of the chance to share with them and now with you my enthusiasm for China, its people, and share it with friends and colleagues. So, 谢谢, as they say in Chinese. Thank you very much for listening.